to you Paul Eichenberg. Now, in Paul's presentation, we want to continue looking out on some of these issues that are impacting the automotive industry. So we welcome Paul Eichenberg, who has over 25 years' experience working with Fortune 500 automotive suppliers, most notably 8 years as the Global Vice President of Corporate Development and Strategy for Magna Powertrain and Magna Electronics. As a chief strategist, Paul oversaw all strategic planning, product management, merger and acquisition activities. During his tenure at Magna, Paul successfully repositioned the business to focus on technologies for the optimization of internal combustion engines, EV and hybrid technologies, ADAS, and autonomous vehicles. So please join me in welcoming Paul to the stage.
Thank you very much. Okay, really what I want to talk to you about is disruption in the automotive industry and what it means to companies. And one of the things I would tell you, back in 2018 in the Mercedes-Benz, or at that time Daimler, annual report, they started to allocate funding to the upcoming disruption that was coming in the industry. And the disruption that they talked about was really electrification and what it meant to the industry. And it was going to have a tremendous impact on two types of suppliers. First suppliers were the suppliers that were going away, the traditional internal combustion engine suppliers. As their markets started to dwindle, what Mercedes did was really feared that those suppliers would go into bankruptcy. And on the opposite side, all the new suppliers that were coming to the industry. And those were the suppliers on the side of electrification, and that the ramp-up curve was going to be so aggressive that those suppliers were going to risk cash flow issues as a result of the capital investment that was required, and they were fearful that those suppliers also were going to go and face potentially bankruptcy. So right now, we are in the midst of that time. Here in North America, you've got about 10% of the mix of vehicles that are fully electrified. In Europe, it's closer to 20%. In Asia, it's approaching 30, 40% pure battery electric vehicles. So there's two things actually today I'm going to speak to you about. First is, what does this impact and what does this time mean for the supply chain as you see it today? Not many suppliers, not many OEMs have started to do what Mercedes did back in 2018, is start to really plan for this type of disruption in the industry. So I'm going to talk to you a little bit about that today. The other thing I'm going to talk to you about is the disruption of the tariffs, okay? And one of the things I always get from suppliers, or I've been getting here over the past several months, is does this fundamentally change what our footprint needs to look like? And that's a question that I think we can start to answer from the behavior we're starting to see that's coming from the tariffs. So those are the two things that really I'm here to talk to you about. But before I start that conversation, this is a slide I like to use to level set everybody, because what I do is strategic planning. And many of you are familiar with planning at different levels of your organization, so I just want to level set with you. What's the horizon that I'm looking at as far as these type of strategic issues? And the first column, what you see here is what you're probably all very familiar with, is the operational planning that goes on in your business. This is looking at the next 12 to 18 months as far as, hey, what can we expect for our operational budgets, our department budgets? What are the detailed tasks that we want to get done over the course of the next year? Many of you are probably already working on your 2026 plans. That's operational. Sorry about that. The next is the business planning. Many of your businesses probably do this 3 to 5 year planning horizon. This is when you get into your capital planning, your financial planning, your HR planning as far as succession, et cetera. But really what I focus on with my clients is this strategic planning. And this is looking out in that 8 to 12 year horizon as far as what's going to happen and how do we have to change and how do we get in front of these issues so that we have an understanding as far as how our portfolio is going to change, what our future needs and gaps are, and ultimately this is where companies start looking at things like valuation analysis to understand, hey, are we really creating value over this longer term horizon? So today, what we're going to focus on is activities much more in that longer term. Not things that you're going to see over the next 18 months, but you're going to see those longer term impacts. And one of the things that we're all in the midst of is this disruption that's taken place when it comes to new vehicle architectures. And when we talk about electrification, this is the spectrum of electrification when it comes to vehicles. And ultimately, what you have is you have this shift between the internal combustion engine to pure battery electric vehicles. That's where you see the disruption. On the left-hand side, from the micro hybrid to the plug-in hybrid, all still use the internal combustion engine. Today, or I should say, let's say 5 years ago, the market for the internal combustion engine was almost $450 billion in car parts. $450 billion. The semiconductor industry became $400 billion for the first time in 2020. So now think of that as the scale. 450 versus the semiconductor industry becoming $400 billion for the first time in 2020. This is a huge disruption that's taken place. It will have a profound impact in the Great Lakes community as far as the number of suppliers that are impacted by that. As a matter of fact, when I was at Magna and I was in charge of M&A, we saw every deal in the industry. And in the Great Lakes region here, I will tell you, this area is just flowered with companies that are 100, 200 million that are making simple car parts for the internal combustion engine, and they won't wake up tomorrow and just say, hey, we're going to make semiconductors. That just doesn't happen. So this is a disruption that's taken place and going to have a tremendous impact, not just in North America, but around the globe. There's 9,500 suppliers to the automotive industry when it comes to the internal combustion engine. They're the companies that are being disrupted. So how does that disruption take place? Here, what you have on the left-hand side is the mechanical systems that you have for the internal combustion engine today. That's being replaced by these new systems, electric batteries, drive motors, and electrical chargers or power electronics that go into these vehicles. And guess what? China has already won when it comes to the electric battery, the power electronics, and the electric motor. Why? Because they have such tremendous scale. And electrical parts scale very differently than mechanical parts. So we have a huge disruption that's starting to take place. And when you start to look at it as far as the number of moving parts in a traditional internal combustion engine are about 125. That goes down to less than 25 moving parts in a battery electric vehicle. This is what is impacting suppliers so significantly. And when you see that, you have 550 parts that go into a traditional internal combustion engine, and it's really apples and oranges. 300 parts going into something like the Leaf. So again, you just don't wake up one morning and say, hey, we're going to make. And as a matter of fact, I can tell you, because we've consulted every type of supplier that has made internal combustion engine parts, and there's about 4 or 5 basic systems that you can make. And for all those suppliers, what they have created is a hyper competitive environment. So coming from Magna, we made all-wheel drive and four-wheel drive systems. We basically had 3 competitors. If you look at a transmission, again, Magna, 3 global competitors when it came to a transmission. A transmission today, an automatic transmission, about an $1,800 assembly. You got 3 competitors. not a hyper-competitive situation. As a matter of fact, everybody stays out of everybody else's business. There's really no pricing pressure as a result, but you go to the replacement system, which is an e-drive. In e-drive, I can name you 25 companies that are trying to make an e-drive. And you know what? An e-drive is nowhere near an $1,800 system. Okay? It's a $500, $600, $700 system that's really an electrical motor. So you've got to have a different type of scale. You have to have different type of components. And at the end of the day, what you have is you have a hyper-competitive situation at which nobody makes money. And again, like I said, it's more than likely that the Chinese companies that are emerging in that space, who are really accumulating scale because their market is moving so much more quickly and aggressive, that are really going to be the winners of the day. So we have a very disruptive environment that we're living in as a result of this transition. And one of the things I want to walk you through are just some examples so you can start to visualize what the impact is. So again, traditional powertrain component market starts to decline. Like I said, here we're about 10%, but think about companies, and I'm going to talk about forging. But think of a forging company. A forging company buys capital, capitalizes that in some cases 20 years. They're living on 4, 5, 6% profit. They have huge capital that they've got to basically amortize over the life of that program, and then you start losing 10% of your market. What happens when you get to 15%? This is the issue that supply chain professionals have to start to plan for. So let's look at this from an example of the number of components that go, mechanical components that go into a traditional powertrain. So you have engine, you have a visualization of what that looks like, you have the transmission as far as those two systems come together. The mechanical system that they're replaced with is this simple motor gearbox assembly, which we call an e-drive, and the complexity reduction is significant. So let me walk you through that. So if we look at forged and machined parts, we have roughly, for a 9-speed automatic transmission, we have 36 components. That's the typical architecture that we see here in North America. This is what those 36 components look like. And as a matter of fact, just to give you an idea, and I'll walk you through, here's the components that go into forge and machine. Again, if you look at a standard 6-cylinder engine, 71 forged components. Now, to give you an idea, the global forging industry is roughly, or global forging for all industries is about a $9 billion market. What I just showed you that goes into the internal combustion engine is more than half of that global industry. So now, what do you do if you're a forging company and the internal combustion engine starts to go away? There are not many places that you can go to. And again, we've done these studies, and I can tell you, nothing is produced at the scale and size that you have in just the internal combustion engine and a transmission. So this gives you an idea of what those components look like and what the scale is, and this gives you an idea of what's happening in the forging industry. So we see short term, okay, roughly about $400 worth of components per vehicle. As you start to introduce hybrid transmissions and hybrid vehicles, whether it's a standard hybrid or it's a plug-in hybrid, you start to see that decrease. But when you go to the battery electric vehicle and then you take into account what type of forging components go into that EV motor and gearbox or that e-drive system, you'll see the significant decrease that starts to take place as far as this industry. But it's not just forging components, so let's look at castings. So castings have anywhere between $400 and $650 worth of components. These are traditionally now aluminum castings that you see in the industry. And again, it's the same type of thing where if we take $650 that you see in a standard V6 automatic transmission vehicle, You'll see hybrids will have somewhat of an impact, but the dramatic impact that takes place in just castings, where again, about two-thirds of that market disappears. So, and it's not just forging and castings. We've looked at this for plastic components also. And what you'll see here, what we've looked at is the Gulf, internal combustion engine vehicle versus the Gulf, the e-Golf, which is a battery electric vehicle. You'll see a 30% decrease in the amount of content that just comes in plastics. So when we talk about disruption, and as supply chain professionals, what you have to be thinking about is how does this ultimately impact our business, and how do we start to build suppliers who are the last man standing? And the idea behind the last man standing or the last survivor is that supplier who has the financial strength to last to the end, where they have other product areas that they're supporting, either the supply base or the OEM, and that they have the strength to be able to sunset these type of components going forward. And I would ask, for those in the industry, how many of you are working in that manner to be able to say, hey, we've got to start to prop up these last survivors so that we no longer have 12, 13, 14 suppliers, but we have 2 or 3 that we think have the financial strength to see it to the end of the days of these type of systems. And that's the type of planning you have to have as you go forward in this. So now I want to talk about the tariffs just briefly. I'm not going to take you through the detail that you just went through, but what I want to do is just talk to you about specifically the idea, is this changing for suppliers and ultimately for OEMs, the idea that they're going to localize here in North America. And that was the idea behind the tariffs, and I'm going to share with you some of the thinking that goes into that right now. So again, you've seen this, the order that came out, Canada and Mexico right now are largely exempt under the USMCA. There is for non-USMCA content, there's 25% tariffs on that, as you see today. But trade partners like Europe, Korea, Japan, right now are under a full 25% tariffs. Would expect that to be negotiated, much like the terms that you've seen from the UK. But trade partners like that are in current negotiations with the administration. If you look at China, China, of course, has had the steepest treatment, but that has been right now as they negotiate that, there's relief around that. But the net effect is this rising cost that's coming to the industry. And the question that I typically get is, okay, do we have to start looking at localizing footprint that was built in Canada or in Mexico, and what do we start to do? And that's what I'll talk about here in a moment. But how did everybody react? Well, of course, everybody has retaliated. And again, we're in this reciprocal agreement between escalation and now in a point of time where I think we're in a stage of negotiation. But ultimately, again, this is here to remind you, what was the intention? And the intention originally was to say, hey, by targeting countries with this trade surplus, can we start to have companies reinvest in U.S. assembly plants, expand their supplier network, and really rely much more so on American labor? That was the idea originally as far as it was sold to the American people. And this idea of repricing, across the globe, repricing these products so that global cost advantage was nowhere, it was no longer there, was sort of the incentive for organizations to say, hey, we're going to reinvest in North America. And I think in the end, you've seen some of that. So companies like Hyundai made a $20 billion investment here in North America. I would argue that they had already planned to do that, as far as many others who had planned have brought those plans forward and made those type of announcements as those companies and those countries negotiate with the administration. But the big thing that happened was this. And this is the UK-US trade agreement that took place back on May 8th. And I think what you'll see is on the vehicle side, it says it right here, UK-built vehicles come in at 10%, which is right now lower than the 25% tariffs on the non-US MCA content vehicles. So what I would tell you, and again, when people ask me, hey, what do you expect is going to happen? Should we be looking at relocating? And I think this is very telling, because what this is this is a precedence as far as where these agreements are more than likely going to end up. So if you look at Europe, if you look at Japan, Korea, non-USMCA compliant vehicles, I would expect this is much more of the type of level that we'll see than what we're seeing right now, 25, 30% or more. And what I expect is, again, this is a negotiation tactic. This isn't a long-term policy shift. And as a result of a negotiating tactic, that means it's temporary. This isn't a time where Toyota, their #1 selling vehicle in the US, is built up at CAMI, the RAV4. Do they sit there and say, hey, do we have to localize that production and close that plant and change what we're going to do? I expect not. Because again, the way that these negotiations are going and the type of precedence that was set here with the UK. So my last slide here, and then I'll open it up for some questions. But basically, this is just a rundown as far as where we're at with the tariffs and all the activities that have taken place. And you'll see the impact. But again, as far as the disruption and the impact that it means to the industry, I think what we're going to see over the next few months is we're going to see, again, more and more trade agreements announced between especially Europe. I'd expect to see something from China, Korea, Japan, et cetera. And as a result, I think it's going to be much more in line with what we're seeing from the UK. So with that, I'll open it up to any questions that you may have. Yep.
Yeah, not sure if you'll be able to answer this, but when you were talking about the shift from combustion to EVs, I'm just painfully aware that that's essentially going to cause the auto industry to start rubbing shoulders a lot more closely with other industries that rely on power electronics, batteries, electronics in general. Are there any sort of hidden dynamics there that we need to be aware of that essentially might cause friction by sort of rubbing shoulders more closely with those other industries?
Yeah, so I think that's, so again, I think the biggest friction we're seeing right now is the rare earth metals. So the majority of rare earth metals come from China. Again, when you really study the situation as far as what China has done with the electric vehicle, I would tell you 10 years ago, at Magna, every internal combustion engine deal, you could go to China and talk to them about buying, buying those type of businesses because they were looking any way possible to get into the automotive industry. Then about 2016, 2017, there was a shift. They had a shift in their industrial policy, and everything moved to EVs. So since that time frame, 2017, let's say, they have been aggressively investing in the idea around the EV and the industry. And they control right now about 90% of the rare earth metal processing, because again, nobody really wants to do that in their countries. So they control that processing and they control a lot of that supply chain. So, you may have followed the news in northern Michigan here, Goshen, which is a company that does a lot of the materials for battery production. They make anode materials. The community there has been fighting them, coming in and bringing their Chinese influence into their region. So again, this is one of the issues that you're going to start seeing is, again, a lot of that supply chain is controlled with the tie of the rare earth metals, and I think this is going to be one of the biggest issues that we have here in North America to figure out how do we start to build our own supply chain. Now, I'll tell you, one of the largest lithium deposits in the world was discovered around Arkansas. So again, there's going to be things, but there has to be incentives for companies to start to invest, to harvest those type of minerals, materials, and build a new supply chain around that. So,
Thank you.
okay, yep.
Anyone?
Other questions? Yeah.
Back here, is he willing to, has any kind of exceptions for like the automotive business been kind of worked on or thought about, like exceptions to tariffs just in case?
Yeah, so I think there's, there's a number of industry committees that have been meeting with the industry or with the administration to try to influence as far as where people feel that needs to go. But nothing definitively has started to come from those type of activities. And again, as a result, that's why I believe this is more negotiating, an opportunity to create an event that leads to the renegotiation of these trade agreements. And obviously, one of the things that came out of the UK was, well, they decided to buy a lot more Boeings, than they would typical Airbus. So that was one of the big things that came out of that trade agreement. And as a result, I think that's where you see this isn't a long-term policy shift that's going to incentivize, U.S. manufacturing as much as it is an opportunity to renegotiate in a more of an opportunistic manner. So, okay.
With a lot of the discussion that's been happening with the trade war, we keep hearing the term framework of an agreement, but no actual agreement.
Mm-hmm.
That's been, like I said, that's the case with the UK agreement, and it's a framework.
Yep.
With China, it's been labeled as a framework.
Yep.
What's your take on it? Because over the past 3 months, Trump has continued to talk tough, but back down at the last minute. How much of this do you think that countries like China, the European Union, India, Brazil, that they're just willing to wait this out and eventually wait out the Trump administration, and just basically put the pain on the U.S. consumer?
Yeah, I don't, again, the intention's not to turn this into a political debate. It's more to, hey, if you look at this long-term, what's the long-term impact it's going to have? And that's typically my focus. But what I would say is any type of deal, and again, you do a merger or an acquisition, you have a framework, which you refer to as an MOU or a letter of intent, and that always is, hey, here's the idea of how we get to a deal, okay? And it's not 100 pages, it's 3-4 pages. And what's really difficult in these type of negotiations is, hey, we can agree to 3-4 pages pretty quickly. But when you put hundreds of pages together to say, here's how it's going to work with the legal support, that's what takes time. So you'll see mergers that drag on as a result of you going through that same type of process. And I would expect it to be pretty typical that you see that this may be a 3-4 month lag from a framework to an actual formal agreement that can be signed. And as a result, I don't necessarily see it as, so if we take the Chinese need this economy to be a part of. They need that. So they're just incentivized as we are to get an agreement. So I don't see this as somebody's waiting to October to see what the Supreme Court does or anything like that. I think in the spirit of what at least I've seen between the UK and the United States, what's taken place between Canada and Mexico and other trade partners, I would expect over the next 3-4 months that these frameworks start to become formalized agreements. So, yep.
Really interesting presentation. Thanks very much. The disruption, the graphics and everything you used was outstanding. How much, speaking of disruption, we're all paying attention to the big, beautiful bill. And, I was just reading today talking about phasing out incentives over time. But certainly they're already under attack. The consumer, the individual being able to have tax incentives to buy electric vehicles. So how much disruption do you think that'll have on the electric vehicle production? And will that, you're talking about these combustible engines disappearing. Will that put a pause on that? Are we headed backwards? Are we past the point of no return?
Yep, that's a great question. And I would say, again, I'm up here, I'm conceding China has won. Okay, China's won because they have very aggressively since 2017 just invested in the idea that the most efficient power source is electrification. I mean, as a matter of fact, a year ago I was working on a project for a commercial vehicle OEM, one of the big three commercial vehicle OEMs, and sat down with the CEO, and the CEO is telling me, hey, the most efficient way, even for a commercial vehicle to operate, is to be fully electrified. Now, recognize that it's going to take time for the industry to get there, but that's the most efficient source. And that's the bet that China has made their bet on. And if we look at the policy here, a year ago, the policy was, as a matter of fact, March 29th of 2024, the Biden administration, through the EPA, approved the commercial vehicle final rule that was driving more and more commercial vehicles towards that. They had the act, the incentives around the investment in electrification, not only in vehicles and not only the consumer incentives, but they also had the incentives around localizing the supply chain and the production here. Now we've gone to the opposite side, which get rid of all of that, and now let's focus back on the internal combustion engine. So is the internal combustion engine going to go away over the next 20 years? No, it's not. But at the same time, I can tell you, because I've done this work for the past 30 years, where is all the technology for the internal combustion engine? It's right here, okay? It's right here that, hey, when it comes to fuel efficiency, when it comes to output, everything, it's here, right in the Detroit, Great Lakes region. I'll tell you, when it comes to EVs, where is that? It's now in China. And that's an opportunity that was missed here. It was an opportunity that was missed in Europe. And I think that's where the idea of global policy, think about this. General Motors, in the final days of the Trump administration, came out and said, hey, our vision is in 2035, everything will be electrified. Now they just came out a few weeks ago and said, they're introducing new electric vehicles, et cetera, et cetera. They're tying into that policy. But at the same time, they're conceding where is the home of that technology going to be? And I'll tell you, there's a company by the name of CATL. And who's heard of CATL? Okay, so yes, you're in the industry. But CATL hasn't been a business for more than 15 years, and they are the world's largest producer of lithium-ion batteries. And they will control the industry, and they're based in China. Okay, so that's what that policy, tying the policy together to those types of shifts, really can do to build an industry. So I would say, you know, again, this is where this is a challenging topic here in North America because we're caught in this gray area. And this gray area is the disruption. And figuring out how we lead is going to be really tough in the environment we're in right now, where we're going from, you know, this polarized world from one view to another. And I think that's one of the things that the industry really has to deal with. So, all right. Thank you very much.